Welcome to everyone. Thank you, Jennifer, Milka, and Taylor for organizing our first Black Studies speaker series, which will take place. This is the second iteration, and it takes place in the fall and winter terms here at Queen's University. Thank you to the panelists for joining us virtually. As I said, this is the second iteration of the Black Studies Speakers series on Black, queer, and quare religions. The speaker series was developed alongside the minor in Black Studies and is intended to illuminate faculty, staff, and student work in our program and think through how Black Studies and Black politics breach university walls. This means, of course, thinking about Black Studies as diasporic in method and theory, and also working out how Black Studies imagines collective liberation, that is Black and non-Black liberation through radical relationality. Jennifer Leath's speaker series attends to all of these nuances, gathering brilliant scholars, activists, leaders, and thinkers who challenge us to grapple with Black queer and Black quare faith across the Black diaspora in various and varying disciplines and in differing intellectual landscapes. I'm very excited to introduce our panel on Black queer, Black quare religions, and Black Christianities. Jennifer, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Katherine. This afternoon, I begin by just acknowledging that Queen's University is situated on the unceded land of the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee peoples. And today I join you from lands of these, as well as the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Chippewa and the Wendat people. May their and our futures be more just than our pasts. This series takes up two of the most contested sites of Black studies, religion and sexuality. Tragically, hegemonically branding and branded versions of Christianity have often led the way in pathologizing, erasing, misunderstanding, and mischaracterizing the sexualities and gender identities of people of African descent. Still, the queer aspects of Black sexualities that are part of our past, present, and futures are silenced and cast as contradictions to who we are as religious and/or believing people and communities. Religion and sexuality and Christianities and sexualities consequently remain as intersecting sites that demand the attention of critical Black studies, as we cannot deny the institutional importance of African and African diasporic churches and Christianities across the globe. These institutions, however, need an opening of imaginative spaces so that we can develop alternative futures where race, class, gender, sexual orientation, ability, age, and other aspects of our beautiful diversity are no longer sounding like a litany of battlefields in wars for the dignities of new humanisms. So this series invites participants to contemplate this intersection of Blackness, religion, and sexuality, but first to address the intersection from the edges and multiplicities of Blackness, religions, and sexualities through queer, Black queer belongings. And then second, to think about the best language to address a Black religious queer space. From the edges and the multiplicities, today we continue our series with Black queer Christianities. Contemplating the linguistic concern, today's panelists take up the challenges and possibilities of E. Patrick Johnson's language of quare for this discourse. And that definition may now be shared with you as a point of reference for us. We are reminded that for E. Patrick Johnson, quare is the opposite of straight, odd or slightly off kilter from that African-American vernacular for queer, sometimes homophobic in usage, always denoting excess, incapable of being contained within conventional categories of being, curiously equivalent to the Anglo-Irish and sometimes Black Irish variant of queer, as in Brendan Band's famous play, The Quare Fellow. One who is committed to struggle against all forms of oppression, one who is appreciative of Black culture and community, one who thinks and feels and acts and sometimes acts up. Quare is to queer as reading is to throwing shade. I I will also share with you the prompt for today's conversation, and invite you to consider this as you hear from our panelists. Finally, I would just like to thank several people who and co-sponsors of this work. Katherine McKittrick, thank you, and Daniel McNeil, Milka and Jorge, Taylor Snack, Taiwa Kalitu, Brima, Danita Anders, Scott Fitzpatrick, Claire Grady Smith, as well as the Religious Coalition of Reproductive Choice and the Black Studies Collective, the Department of Gender Studies, and the School of Religion, Cultural Studies as well at Queen's University. So with that, I will present our guests to kick off today's conversation. First, Dr. Ashon Crawley is an artist, writer, and teacher based in Charlottesville, Virginia, exploring the intersection of spirituality, queerness, and Blackness. His pronouns are he, him, his, and we are looking forward to hearing from him. Also, we welcome Danyelle Thomas, who is a writer, speaker, and faith leader of Unfit Christian, a digital faith community at the intersection of faith, race, gender, and sexuality. Her pronouns are she, her, hers. And we are looking forward to hearing from Danyelle. Reverend Michael Blair is the General Secretary of the United Church of Canada. He is the first openly gay person of color serving in this role in the church's history. Reverend Blair lives in Toronto with his partner and is the father of 2 sons. His pronouns are he, him. Reverend Jide Macaulay is the founder of House of Rainbow CIC, which began as a safe place for LGBTQ people of faith in a hostile context, became a weekly gathering for LGBTQ plus Christians in Lagos, which the media soon described as Nigeria's first gay church, and is now a global organization based in London, but delivering project work around the world. He is a children's champion with Africans Unite Against Child Abuse. He also serves as the chairperson of the International Network of Religious Leaders living with or personally affected by HIV and AIDS in Europe, and is a volunteer chaplain at Mildmay in the UK. And Reverend Macaulay's pronouns are he, his, and him. Reverend Dr. Yvette Flunder, Bishop Flunder, is a San Francisco native, has served her call through prophetic action and ministry for justice for over 30 years. The call to blend proclamation, worship, service, and advocacy on behalf of those most marginalized in church and society led to the founding of the City of Refuge United Church of Christ in 1991. In 2003, Reverend Dr. Flunder was consecrated presiding bishop of the Fellowship of Affirming Ministries, a multi-denominational coalition of over 100 African-American Christian leaders and laity. She is a graduate of the Certificate of Ministry and Master of Arts program at Pacific School of Religion and received her doctorate of ministry from the San Francisco Theological Seminary. And Bishop Flunder is a Demos board member and senior fellow at Auburn Theological Seminary and Andover Newton Seminary. She has also served as adjunct professor and speaker at Pacific School of Religion and numerous seminaries and universities. And so we are delighted to have Bishop Flunder with us as well. She is also an award-winning gospel music artist and author of Where the Edges Gather, a theology of homiletic and radical inclusion. Also, we welcome as our moderator today, the Reverend Dr. Brandon Thomas Crowley, who is a pastor, preacher, author, and scholar in African American church studies and Black theology. Since 2009, he has served as the senior pastor of the historic Myrtle Baptist Church in West Newton, Massachusetts. Reverend Crowley earned a PhD in Church and Society and a Master of Sacred Theology with a certificate in social justice from Boston University's School of Theology, Master of Divinity from Harvard University's Divinity School, and Bachelor of Arts in Religion and a certificate in moral cosmopolitanism and pastoral leadership from Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia. Reverend Crowley's manuscript is titled Queering Black Churches, Dismantling Heteronormativity in African American Congregations with Oxford University Press. Presently, Reverend Crowley is a lecturer in ministry studies at Harvard University's Divinity School in Cambridge, and his pronouns are he, him, his. This panel conversation is meant not only as an opportunity to share, but also as an opportunity to hear. And so we encourage your participation through the Q&A function for those of you who are a part of this conversation as listeners, and would like to engage those who will be presenting. Also, immediately following today's panel, members of the African Methodist Episcopal Church who are joining this conversation are invited to stay, and others who wish on the platform for some informal responses from AMEs and a brief conversation. Thank you. Thank you for participating, and we look forward to what is to come. I'll turn it over now to Reverend Dr. Brandon Crowley.
Good afternoon, and welcome to Black Queer Christianities, a panel produced by Queen's University. Thank you to Dr. Jennifer Leath and the planners of this event for the gracious invitation to moderate this afternoon's panel. As Dr. Leath said, my name is Brandon Crowley, and I will serve as the moderator for our panel this afternoon. Today, we will discuss if the word quare is a helpful or unhelpful term for Black LGBTQIAP+ folk. And I want to begin our time together with some definitions and some framing. The word quare was developed, as Dr. Leath said, and coined by E. Patrick Johnson, a performance and African American studies scholar and now dean at Northwestern University in the early 2000s. Quare, according to Johnson, is a theory of and for gays and lesbians of color. Johnson attributes the word quare to his grandmother, whose Southern dialect caused her to pronounce the word queer as quare. At the heart of quare theories, or in our interest today, queer theology, queer Christianities, are Black religious discourses and praxes that pose existential questions about the meanings of Blackness, gender, sexuality, ability, class, geography, and sexuality. These questions often manifest in the development and evaluation of prospects of liberation, healing, justice, and transformation of the concepts of gender and race. Scholars have employed queer theory to study, disrupt, and transform systems and structures of power embedded in anti-Black racism, heteronormativity, white supremacy, and patriarchy. Simply put, as is stated in the definition that was posted in the chat, womanist is to feminist as queer is to queer. Queer theory centers on the lived experiences and knowledge of Black lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender folk. Like feminist theoethics, queer theoethics is also structurally comprised in ways that inhibit its flourishing within mainstream Black religious discourses and praxes. For while Black studies and queer studies have offered an important theoretical and historical understanding of Blackness and LGBTQIAP+ experience respectively, queer theory seeks to interrogate Black studies and queer studies together. Queer theory is a methodology that examines how the intersections of anti-Black racism, heteronormativity, cisgenderism, and all other forms of oppression can birth a praxis of social transformation. Queer theory also resists white supremacy and heterosexism and draws attention to the disregarded histories, contributions, and experiences of Black LGBTQIAP+ folk. This framing brings us to the purpose of our panel this afternoon. We're going to focus on the following questions. In what ways does queer resonate in Black religious discourses and praxes, especially those of Black forms of Christianity or Black Christianities. To what extent is the word quare a helpful or unhelpful linguistic option? Why or why not? To respond to these and other questions related to queerness, we have 5 distinguished panelists that Dr. Leath has already introduced who will give responses. We will begin with Bishop Flunder.
Good afternoon, everyone. I trust that I am both being seen and heard. I framed this conversation as a Pentecostal for whom queer is not enough. I am a desperate preacher who knows personally how theologies are fluid and new ones are born at friction points. My voice is rooted in the African-American, Southern-influenced Pentecostal Trinitarian Church, where passion for God in Jesus is heard and seen in songs, in preaching, dancing, and prayer. I have struggled with the bloody history of the Christian church and its interpretation of the Bible, like so many of my colleagues, but I have not struggled with the freestyle celebratory worship of the Pentecostal church. My ongoing struggle has been with the Christian church's ever-changing position regarding its treatment of women, its LGBTQI plus offspring, war, immigrants, people of color, and indentured servitude or slavery. And by the way, my grandmother, Bessie Lee Hamilton, born 1895, was the daughter of Stella Wyatt, who was born a slave. I am a multiple degreed avowed womanist and a reconciling liberation theologian who dances in the spirit and speaks in tongues. Holding on to Jesus, despite the church and the tortured interpretations of scripture, which were and are used to mortally wound my people and my faith, has been a lifelong journey. I have served an incredible and desperate people, primarily Black, same-gender loving, LGBTQI+, many who are artists, professionals, degreed, as well as those who are in recovery, those who have physical and emotional illnesses, who at times relapse into self-loathing, struggling to make sense of their lives on the margins of religion, society, and family. And please know they are my beloved. Yet being othered beyond the otherness of queer includes the accompanying realities of racism and sexism, new politically based forms of slavery, unfair lending opportunities, savage policing, unequal access to education, while simultaneously not being embraced by families and faith communities of origin. Healing these wounds has been the mission and the heart of City of Refuge and of the Fellowship of Affirming Ministries in my now 40+ years of ministry. We can find God in the struggle for equality and parity and justice. The struggle is in the long, strong, deep, resonant base of what we teach and preach and pray about. We've come through many dangers, toils, and snares. This is foundational to our community and the locus of our passion. If we cannot see God in the struggle and believe that day after day, God will make it all right, we cannot see God at all. Seeing by this faith is what heals us. And so, I have been blessed to see peace and security present in the lives of many of those I serve. Danyelle Thomas said that our slave ancestors had a basis for calm, a special inner peace born of a profound conviction that their self-worth had been well established already and was guaranteed by the ruler of the universe. And I say this is a peace born from the assurance that God is on our side. Yet, these multiple oppressions do not fall comfortably into the accepted definitions of queer. There must be some nomenclature that captures what is constantly seeking self-affirmation amid multiple oppressions. And this is the time I encourage a deeper knowing and a deeper naming for this experience. And by the way, quare will work for me. God bless.
Thank you, Bishop Flunder. I'm going to ask Reverend Jide to follow Bishop Flunder, and after he goes, then Dr. Blair, Danyelle Thomas, and then we will end with Ashon Crawley.
Thank you so much, Reverend Dr. Brandon. And it's a great honor for me to be here today, and I'm so delighted to be part of this conversation. And as I ponder in what way does queer Christians resonate, I think it's important for us to know that, first, I've always believed, that we are children of the living God, and that will come in a little moment. But I think my own personal journey has been one that has been filled with both pain, anxieties, and struggles. But what I'm so delighted about is the opportunity and the grace to reconcile my own faith and my sexuality. It is important to reflect on that, or to reflect on the authentic existence of Black queer Christians with the ability to align, also with our ancestral understanding, the wisdom and rituals that we grew up with. But unfortunately, queer histories has been brushed aside. But we do know that they are well documented, because before the missionaries, the colonizers come to the shores of Africa, queerness has always been in existence. But we see today a great denial through criminalization of queer people, through denial in faith spaces in our churches, particularly. Some aspects of modern Christianity has ignited the abuse of queer or God's queer children and subjected those vulnerable by faith to a fearful existence. The reluctance to investigate and challenge scriptures has brought many to our knees, and has actually made many queer people to even question their own existence. I've been very grateful to God, for my pathway in life. I was first ordained to ministry in 1998 at my father's ministry. It was a conservative Christian environment. But as I grew older and mature in my own faith, and I continued to challenge, issues around homophobia and transphobia, I came in contact with the Metropolitan Community Church in London. And by 2005, I was ordained into this ministry. And that actually helped me to continue to form my own understanding of queerness. Some aspects of our lives have been eroded. And I think that we need to begin to look at inclusive Christian theology that provides people with a pathway to a loving God and access to Christ through the power of the Holy Spirit, which includes a spirit of the ancestors. For me particularly, there is the theology of the resurrection. And the scriptures came to mind just a few weeks ago in our lectionary. It was the one that asked a question about marriage, whether or not, the woman who had married 7 brothers will be able to marry all the brothers in heaven, or which one of them will be the brothers. And that brought to mind, the importance of our celestial bodies of queerness, and that we are not in jeopardy of our reunion with Christ, even in the eternal life. I believe that people of God are promised, without exception, whether we are alive or dead, we'll still remain alive to God. And that means that for me, for our queerness is, the justification of our queerness is so important, to the point that marriage in itself is not a criteria for heaven. When we begin to talk about the injustices that we see and the experience today, it's not limited to queer bodies. We have seen the outcome of racism, misogyny, the evil of patriarchy, toxic masculinity, stigmatization, and the abuse of people with disabilities. It is therefore necessary to invoke the spirit of justice, and in our theology, end the struggle of those underrepresented in our society. Nothing more profound than what Micah says in 6:8, that what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk in humility with our God. I think it is so important that we stand for those justices, and begin to speak those justice in the life of those that are queer people. As people, we have a great responsibility towards humanity, and therefore there is no question about how best to handle matters of injustices, including homophobia, transphobia, unjust laws against vulnerable and those underrepresented. I'm from Nigeria, for the record, and Nigeria still holds laws that criminalizes queer people and can send me to jail. Unfortunately, religious communities mostly in Nigeria support those unjust laws. For healing to begin, we must let go of our pain and grudges. We are called to always repay evil with a blessing, which for many, regardless of sexuality, nationality, or race, can be difficult. So for many queer people, we are called to a place of forgiveness, which translates into our own peace and peace for our own society. There is always an expectation that we must forgive. We must be resilient to the abuse that we face. But grace lies in the ability to reward with a blessing in who we are. And finally, as we talk about healing, is the epitome of the journey of reconciliation. I've spoken courageously about taking the word back, asserting control of our own understanding of God and the embodiment of our humanity is so important. I rely heavily on Romans chapter 9, verse 25 to 26. That has helped me to understand that speaking to queer people who have been displaced eternally or externally can be difficult, but there is a remarkable point of healing. We are God's people, we are God's beloved, we are God's chosen one. And when the dust of hatred settles, we will see that we are leaders of great proportion and ambassadors of God's kingdom. When we come to take control of the inclusive gospel with forgiveness for those who malign or ostracize us, we are indeed the transformed individuals. Reconciling faith and sexuality is key for every queer person. And it is in this journey that we know that our wrestle is not carnal, but there is a need to stand up for justice and be the light of God. My friends, I share with you this moment that our ways, that we can resonate is no longer to struggle with what others struggle with, but to know that we stand with God in who we are. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I will kind of come to this conversation in two ways. But first of all, I think I want to say it's important for me to begin by locating myself. I'm a Black gay man of African Caribbean descent, serving in the largest Protestant church in Canada as its general secretary. A role I recognized that I could not play in any Black church tradition here in Canada. The church I am a part of is predominantly white. It is liberal in its theological orientation, and it is the first church back in 1988 to affirm the full acceptance of queer identities into its membership and ministerial roles. It is a space where conversation about queerness and identities can be had without fear. So you see, my location influences how I come to the question. As a Black queer religious practitioner, not situated in a Black religious tradition, there is very little resonance of a language and construct of queer in the discourse or in my discourse or religious practice. From the context of Canada, this is due in part to the reality of the absence of any robust Black religious discourse. Compared to the United States, where there's an overarching meta-narrative rooted in the memory and legacy of the transatlantic slave trade. with a strong African-American Black identity and a complex web of Black churches engaging in theological reflection on themes of identity, liberation, and justice, the Canadian Black religious landscape is fragmented, theologically diverse, and lacks any cohesive theological discourse on Black identity and religious imagination. To be sure, there are those who are working to unearth the history and contribution of the Black church within the religious landscape. People like Elaine Spencer, Carol Duncan, Denise Gillard, Ronaldo Walcott, to name a few. Missing, however, from the discourse is a conversation on Black religious identities and liberative practices. And maybe the reality is that it is not possible amidst the diversity of theological and religious identities. I think those of us in Canada can learn from the work of people like Anthony Reddy and Michael Jagassar in the United Kingdom, working to articulate a contextual Black religious and theological discourse. I have raised the contextual issue because it is important to be attentive to and to articulate the assumptions of what we mean by Black religious discourse, both within the academia and the church. Given the complex diversities of Black experience, geographic and religious expression, what is the starting point when we talk about Black religious discourse? In which context are we talking about a Black religious discourse? Africa, North America, Latin America, or the Caribbean? It is important where we begin. I recognize that queer theologizing begins with the experience of queer bodies. The articulated bodily experience of queer people are deviations from the heteronormative notions of desire, sexuality, and gender. Queering those notions mean recovering them from their heteronormative captivity. Queering meant broadening their meaning to include a spectrum of other bodily experiences. That is why the battle cry of queer theologies is inclusivity. And this emerged from the limitation of heteronormative thinking, which does not capture and even demonize the experience of queerness. Looking from a queer lens, heteronormative thinking seems to work towards the annihilation of queer experience and queer bodies. Such is not the queer project, as I understand it. In opposition to heteronormative thinking, queerness embraces variation, diversity, multiplicity, or the emergence of an evolving, self-directing, self-conscious individual or communities. I think queer discourse and a fresh appreciation of Black lives in the light of the murder of many Black people in the white-dominated communities, which worldview was shaped and informed by the logic of white supremacy, have progressed us to the historical junction where it is felt that the term and its meaning does not capture our common experience as Black people. If we put Frantz Fanon into the discussion, what he will say is that white queerness is not only dismisses our common heritage of slavery and colonization, but also it erases the erasure and murder of Black bodies. The term queer does not capture our Blackness. It does not account for colonial legacies and the experience of slavery and white supremacy, as well as the captivating legacies of hip hop and R&B and jazz music or the Black church, which can only emerge from a culture that is stiff on the experiences such as we have. Black people hence need a new term. The captivity and ability to give name to a thing indeed is an exercise of power. If by queer we mean to refer to ourselves as Black people inhabiting the peripheries of the heteronormative framework and white supremacy, then it is a possibility that we can use the term queer. So acknowledging context and acknowledging the reality of terminologies that need to speak to our differences and variety, and recognizing that the concept of queer is both helpful in allowing for conversation on diversity and difference, while at the same time it is a contested one. And given the fact that it is shaped by a context of whiteness and white privilege, with not a strong sense of an anti-oppression framework, might it be helpful, rather than parsing queer from queer, that we root our conversation in a concept closer to that of Ubuntu, recognizing that language does not invite conversation into the fullness of what it means to be human, and to challenge the injustices and oppression cannot contribute to the liberative call for the fullness of life for all. Thank you.
So as someone who is situated at the intersection of my Blackness, my womanhood, my bisexuality, and as someone who does public work of centering Blackness and Black faith, I looked to the sacred texts of Black culture to really see and unpack how I felt about quare to queer, as reading is to throwing shade. So I went to Paris is Burning and looked to the words of Dorian Corey, where shade comes from reading. Reading is what comes first. Reading then is the real art form. And when you found a flaw and exaggerated it, you have gotten yourself a good read. But when you are all of the same thing, then you have to go to the fine point. For me, the core of reparative and restorative justice, that work is to go to the fine points, to uncover the flaws for exaggerated focus by those who otherwise would ignore it as the same. When we insist on homogeneity, when we insist on sameness as evidence, an evidentiary of, or a reward for the work of justice, the flaws then become willfully overlooked. I think we see this often in homogenous declarations like love is love, or perhaps even Black Lives Matter, where we have to ask ourselves, is it just Black cis heteronormative lives? And is love end and begin in equitable marriage options? Or is that complicated by nuanced expressions in other identity forms? I think these well-intentioned sentiments tend to demand assimilation into what is normative and silences voices of dissent, not just those that are phobic or antagonistic, but also those whose praxes of justice seeking and allyship are threatened by the revelation of the finer points revealed from reading the situation in all of our nuances, in all of our lenses, in all of our epistemologies. So therefore, I look at queer as an option that does not allow us to shy away from the interconnectedness of one's experience as evidence enough for both valid praxis and epistemology to name our specific and nuanced needs in the pursuit of communal justice. So in my work of deconstructing Black religious experience, specifically and particularly Black Protestant Christianity, I'm primarily talking to an audience of people who are all the same, right? Black Christians frustrated with the experiences of religious trauma and hypocrisy. And so when I call out financial and sexual and spiritual misconduct of pulpit actors, It is not a read for the audience. I am stating the obvious. But it is a statement that is merely homogenous in its experience and easily relatable because it is grounded in their own lived experiences. It is evidence enough. This then requires my work to go to the finer points, the intersections of race, gender, sexuality, class, and faith. Because without those intersecting knowledges, religious deconstruction becomes yet another prison of homogeneity. That only brings liberation to those whose embodied realities present no flaws in the quest for justice to erase complex differences. In many ways, I believe that religious deconstruction is to queer, as religious decolonization is to quare. In a way, queer theory, and more subjectively, religious deconstruction, emphasizes adherence to hegemonic binaries and hierarchical needs for justice, asking us to prioritize sexuality in our identity formation and ignore the nuance of contradictory cultural and communal connectedness. In its pursuit of justice, queer theory, as juxtaposed to queerness, forces compartmentalization of identity, or one may find themselves otherwise labeled as a threat to justice. The disruption of homogenizing theoethics is the finest point. Queering justice, then, is as much about sexual formation as it is about expanding and redefining what justice is, who it is for, and what each of us must concede in order to get it. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I am using my phone because my iPad died. And so I apologize. I have to actually also read my thing from my phone. So I might go off camera. I don't know what's going to happen when I do this. But I am very thankful for the invitation by Dr. Leath and my co-panelists and the words that they've given. This should be really short. Eddie Glaude, in his short book titled A Short Introduction to African American Religion, says the following: African American religion is the practice of freedom. The Black religious imagination is used in the service of opening up space closed down by white supremacy. African American religion is a sign of difference, and African American religion insists on an open-ended orientation. African American religion offers resources for African Americans to imagine themselves beyond the constraints of now. End quote. Any doctrine or theological position or proposition, or any tradition or structure of belief that is sustained in African America or Black religious practice that is not in the service of the flourishing of all life, then it is not about the practice of freedom. It's not about the practice of difference. It's not about open-endedness. And it is antithetical to the traditions of Black folks from which these traditions emerge. And to be in the posture and the practice of being open-ended is to, with joy and delight, tarry for more to emerge, for otherwise possibility to happen. This means that alternatives to what is considered to be normal already exist for us, and that Black religion becomes a primary staging ground for us to sense beyond the constraints of the now how alternatives to the normative are constantly sort of emerging in front of us. And they point to us the ways that often it is the practice of alternatives that are constantly being enacted upon, and that we have to protect and cultivate these practices of difference. I have a friend who says that Black music since 1900 hasn't just changed the world in terms of the kinds of musical traditions it allows to grow and flourish: ragtime, the blues, jazz, spirituals, gospel, R&B, soul, funk, disco, rock and roll, electronic, house, go-go, and hip hop, to name but a few. But Black music does so in a kind of intense and intensely meditative and intentional way. It's as if there were a valve that was released, and what came gushing and rushing out was the creative possibility that was already always possible. and taking things as materials with which to experiment and create something new, something otherwise original, is what Black music seems to do more emphatically than anything else. And it seems to be what the practice of Black religious or Black spiritual practices too. So for me, the question is, what does this have to do, this intensity and this open-endedness, this moving against constraint, and this practice of improvisation, which is an intellectual practice of the social? What do these have to do with how womanist is in relation to feminist, and the ways that E. Patrick Johnson is trying to say queer is in relation to quare? It seems to me that both Alice Walker and E. Patrick Johnson help us realize that there are relations of intensity and intentionality, that the relation of womanist to feminist and the relation of queer to quare is a relation of intensity. It's like the making of Black music in the so-called New World. This intensity of music making happens often, though not always. Think of Aretha Franklin live at the Fillmore, singing Dr. Feelgood as an example. It often, but not always, happens in the church. And the Black church is a space of intensity where queerness can be practiced and participated in and simultaneously denounced and demeaned. But queer and quare also, I think, compel us to interrogate the doctrinaire ways that Black religion is often conflated with Black church, especially in the United States. We need to attend to regionalism in the way that quare is an articulation of a regional aesthetic practice. Quare is not something that is a universal that should be taken by everyone, because everyone's Black grandmama don't say quare, because everyone's Black grandmother is not from North Carolina. This is important. That difference does not mean we have to demean or dispense with it, that we actually have to cultivate and celebrate the fact of that difference. But that difference names the fact that difference exists. And insofar as difference exists, it's something that we can and should be in relation to, and think about the various iterations and regionalisms from which we emerge, and how those regionalisms actually give us a way to think about our place in actual material space and time in the material world. And so thinking with quare for me is really important, because it gives me a way to think about how we can celebrate and cultivate difference, but also in that celebration and that cultivation, recognize that difference is the only thing that we have in common, that difference is the thing that we are constantly in relation to and producing with one another, and that difference and its cultivation might be the solution for refusing what my dear friend Camila Mumine calls religious chauvinism, the idea that the Black church is the only articulation of Black spiritual practice, that the Black church is the only place from which a spiritual practice of intensity and improvisation happens, that Black church is the only place that carries this kind of queer content that is liberatory and freeing, even when it is demeaned and denounced, that we have to be willing to think about how the church opens us up to other kinds of religious, spiritual, and affective orientations in the world. I will end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashon. Thank you, Danyelle. Thank you, Reverend Blair, Reverend Jide, for your presentations. You've essentially described, each of you have described quare in your own way as a retheorization of the culturally responsive pedagogies of queerness and Blackness. In your writings and in your statements, you've described quare as an aesthetic that seeks to shift the paradigm of responsiveness away from deficit-based responses towards difference and regionality, to use Ashon's words, and the act of sustaining said differences. I do wonder what the panelists would say to a sort of counter argument that I have heard before, that queer theories that are not innately queer are not only unqueer and unquare, but also unethical and antithetical to the original subversiveness within the word queer itself. In other words, when queer theories reinforce whiteness, patriarchy, sexism, transphobia, classism, or resistance towards womanism for the sake of gender demolition alone, that it is actually no longer queer, but then just white supremacy. So this causes me to ask, is queer, and I'm just doing this to sort of get our conversation sparked, is queer actually important or useful language for what it means to be Black and queer and Christian? And then I think it's also important for us to maybe think about, is there a difference between those who identify as queer and those who identify as Black queer folk? Like, how are we, is it possible that those are two different categories? I'm thinking about in the same way that we think about womanism versus the Black feminists who continue to embrace the word feminism while the presence of womanism is still present. Like, is it possible for us to distinguish these two disciplines, as to use the word that one of our panelists mentioned earlier, as describing queerness as an option? What does queerness mean in the context of also Black Christianities? This panel is about Black queer Christianities. We're talking very specifically about Christianity in this conversation, and even in the ways that it opens us up to other things, but directly to Black Christianities in particular. So how does queerness speak to Black Christianities as a religious tradition? Is this word a tangential conversation? And how does it affect how we think of community? So let's direct that conversation to one particular panelist who brought up this idea of community, Dr. Blair, who identified as a Black gay male of Afro-Caribbean descent, serving in a large white Protestant Canadian church as a general secretary. You talked about the fact that there's very little resonance of the language and construct of queer in the discourse and religious praxes that you are a part of, and you consider this absence to be because of a lack of robust Black religious discourse in your context. And so in response to that, you state that rather than parsing out queer from queer, I was really intrigued by this statement, that it might be helpful if we were to root the conversation in a concept closer to Ubuntu. That really struck me. And I want to know if you could say more about what you mean by this, and especially in connection with my previous statements about what does queerness mean for how we think about community. And you used the word Ubuntu. Are you suggesting that we should use Ubuntu also as a way of describing one's self rather than queer or with queer? Can you talk more with us about that?
Thanks for the question. I think a couple of things I would say. The kind of definition of queer, or the kind of history of queer, Q-U-E-E-R, focuses around differences, but it's basically focused around, or in the discourse, it's around sexual and gender identities. So in some ways, a word that had lots of history has been kind of recaptured and rearticulated around that. What it doesn't do, I think, is allow for the vast ways in which there is diversity. And so, to your point around community, we don't think about communities as being queer, as a way of expression, giving expression to the differences. So I think that would be part of my starting point. I think when I think of, and this may be a bit of a stereotypical thing, when I think of the kind of Black religious ideologies that in themselves tend to be fairly homophobic, and part of that is from its understanding tradition of scripture and all that kind of stuff, it tends to dehumanize those of us who are part of the LGBTQ continuum. It doesn't see us as persons. And so I think in some ways to use a word that's similar, the quare, to queer, doesn't get us to a point where we can actually have a conversation about the innate dignity of human persons, and that our conversation and our way of being in the world is around the fact that we are created in the image of God, we bear the image of God, and one of the things that is critical to imaging is diversity and difference. God didn't create us all the same. And I think in some ways to use a language that pushes against just a discussion around sexual identity to a language that begins to enable us to think about the breadth of diversity may have, in the end, an opportunity in Black religious traditions that tend to be very homophobic, a way of breaking open the conversation and dialogue.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. So I want to go to Reverend Jide now. In your written submission, you did not use the word quare, Q-U-A-R-E, but used queer to talk about its connection with African practices and the history of queerness in Africa. And so Dr. Blair brought up Ubuntu, which is an African concept. And so I want to ask you just very directly to respond to this idea. Can you describe what it means to be Black, queer, and African? And are you using the word queer or quare? And to explain how you are defining those terms.
Thank you so much. I don't think that we're using the word queer yet. I think the word queer has only just recently come into our own vocabulary. I think for many Africans, and indeed many people in the global South, we actually do not have the vocabulary for even queer, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender. We just knew very much about our own existence. But I think what it need to say is that the absence of queer theology discourse in Africa is indeed problematic. We certainly need a reflective theology that is traditionally appropriate, culturally sensitive for those who are same gender loving in Africa or indeed in the global South. Of course, there is also the impact of criminalization that is also brought about by conservative theological views. So there is a great sense of evasiveness in terms of how we use those words. The word queer is currently being radically included in many of our discourse in Africa. There's no question about it. And a quick example is in 2020, just around October 2020, to be precise, there was a protest in Nigeria against police brutality called End SARS. Now, of course, in that particular demonstration, there were queer people who went out with a placard saying, "Queer Lives Matter." And as you can imagine, we're still talking about Black Lives Matter, Nigerian Lives Matter, but when queer people in Nigeria decided that they want to claim their queerness, they were met with brutality. But of course, I think that there is still a heavy denial of queerness. in that particular, in Africa, and also within the faith context as well. But it is important that we continue to have this conversation in order to be able to respond adequately to some of the challenges we face. Thank you.
And I would ask also to just hone in a bit on what you've been describing as this sort of pre-existing history of queerness existing in Africa. Would you say that it is the result of colonization and the Christianizing of the continent of Africa that has led to this excessive homophobia? Since we're in a discussion about Christianity, could we possibly pin Christianity as the sort of problem here?
I don't actually have to say it. I think it's something that we know, that the narratives from the global north actually impacts on the narrative of the global south. But I think that more recently, and I'm really glad for this platform, is that we have recognized that, and and the work that the Fellowship of Affirming Ministries are doing, led by our mom, Bishop Flunder, is creating and raising theologians in Africa in order to have their own narrative. And I think that is very important. There is certainly no doubt about the impact of colonialism, the impact of conservative theology that actually, changes all of our culture. In the last week, for example, I've been talking about, how do you respond to the worship of Ogun and Oshun and all the other African gods? And I said to this person that, look, I align with those worship because when the colonizers came, or I would say bad missionaries came, they said to us that, the Oshun and the Oguns are not God, they are lesser gods, but they're not. As a Christian today, it's very possible for me to align with all the African ancestry gods, as well as my Christian teaching that I know today. But I think that, the fact is that there is still a lot of theories in the global north that impacts the global south. But I think there needs to be a paradigm shift so that, those in the global south begin to have the narrative and we begin to document them. And I'm so glad, I think it was Reverend Blair that mentioned Anthony Reddy. Anthony Reddy worked alongside many Black South Africans in terms of developing Black theology. There is so much work, but it's slowly coming up. But I'm just so glad that it's happening. I mean, a couple of years ago, before the pandemic, I was involved with St. Mokitimi Methodist Seminary, where there was a lot of conversation about Black theology, especially how it affects, the interpretation and scriptures understanding around queerness as well. So there is a lot of work going on, but we're hopeful that, we will meet a lot of the responses that are needed. Thank you.
Thank you for helping us to ground this academic discussion in some very practical ways, that there are contexts that have not even started having conversations around queerness yet, because just the concept of being gay and lesbian is still very challenged. So we thank you for helping us to ground that. You mentioned your mother in the gospel, and I want to call on her now. Bishop, in your written response, the title of it just captured me: A Pentecostal for Whom Queer is Not Enough. And you stated that theologies are fluid. I loved that. And that new ones are born at friction points. Could you talk to us about what friction points have brought us to this conversation around queerness and queerness in Christianity, and in particular in Black Christianity? I think we can often talk about the larger concepts of the church, but I'm wondering about bringing it home into the Black space. And I also want you to, you said that queer is not enough. Could you spend some time talking about why queer is enough for you personally?
Thank you so much, Dr. Brandon. A couple of things. First of all, I'm 67 years old. Let's put that out there. And I have been colored. I've been a Negro. I've been Black. I've been African American. I've been Pan American. I've been a person of African descent. I have been a whole lot of things in my lifetime. And each time I became one of these new things. It was because of a movement. Something happened that caused us to name ourselves something else. And it's just a matter of sounds and words and nomenclature. But the point is, we embraced something because what we had before that did not essentially get the message out about how we are thinking and feeling in this time. I'm Black again, for the most part, and this is helpful because it doesn't take so many letters, you know. but because it has changed, it's metamorphosized from what it was when people called you Black when I was a kid coming along. It was very different, right? I think the same thing is true. It's not so much that I'm looking for queer because it's a magic word that will embrace everything. It is because I think it is time for a different identity, and something that in many ways both informs and encourages our being able to celebrate the many things we are now in this present metamorphosis. And I was raised in one of the most theologically, one of the tightest theological girdles that you can almost have, and that's the Trinitarian Pentecostal church. I mean, for heaven's sake, you would go to hell just for cutting your hair. I mean, it was real serious. I mean, we sent people to hell in a handbasket all the time. It was just all the time. And consequently, as I am watching so many of you, can I just say from 67, let me say that, so many of you who are so brilliant in these conversations, I am also simultaneously watching certain things happening in the church and for people who came out of the churches that were extremely conservative, having voices in miscellaneous places. I'm a gospel music artist, as you know, and let me just say this way, there would not be any gospel music if it weren't for queer people. The greatest singers, the greatest writers, the greatest organizers of choirs, the quartet singers. I mean, I go back a ways. The heart of gospel music is deeply influenced by same gender loving people who spent most of their time in closets. In fact, that was the thing that would get you in. If you were willing, and I know this is off kilter a bit, but y'all know me real good. I remember when I discovered that I was a same gender loving woman in the Pentecostal church, specifically in the Church of God in Christ, that one of the missionaries came to me one day and she said, "Baby," she said, "I just want you to know we know who you are." And I said, "Well, what does that mean?" Because I kind of knew where she was going with it. She said, "We know who you are." She said, "All you need to do is get yourself a little husband." That's what she told me. And what was so interesting about it was the little part, not just get myself a husband, but get myself a little husband, which suggested that he would be cooperative, come along with the program. And once I met her little husband, I understood completely what it was that she was talking about. What am I suggesting to you? When you're in and part of these organizations and part of this reality, I remember when you had to make a choice about what you could say, what you could be, what you could confess to, what you could agree with. And if you agreed enough with the requirement, you could remain. Closets were full of people. I didn't never have to leave church to learn how to engage in sex. It's a perfect art. You just have to know how to go about it, right? What became problematic was the lying, was the inconsistent realities with inside myself, being one person at one time and another person at another time, and not being able to fully affirm myself, fully affirm Shirley, fully affirm the connection that was our life. Well, I am saying in so many words that we have got to come out with some words that embrace that part of the journey. That part of the journey that is informed theologically, that part of the journey that is informed spiritually, that part of the journey that is informed in and among Black people, so we can begin to teach Black people and share with Black people, because my greatest pushback wasn't from outside of Black people, it was from Black people. And so, and as hard as it is for me oftentimes to say it, the Black gospel artists that are passed away and Black preachers that are passed away that were same gender loving, that were gay people, that were queer people, I know their names, and I'm kind, I'm kind not because I have to be, I am kind. What do I mean by that? I don't call their names while they're alive. I am likely, however, to call them after they have passed away. Because what we need is a name for what it means to have all of the multiple concomitant oppressions of being Black, of being diminished, of being given houses that were leaching disease in the soil, nasty water, going to the army, come back, your GI Bill doesn't work for you because you can't use it in the neighborhood where you want to live. There's so much that I could say about what we have experienced all these years. But we have abused our own children by creating just like churches created a second-class citizenship for women, that second-class citizenship for LGBT people, while embracing all of these gifts. 50% of the tenors, 25% of the altos, and about 10% of the sopranos, and just about every choir that I have ever known in my life, who made our worship so powerful. And the brilliant people who have moved on and done work in theological education, brilliant writers, brilliant teachers, brilliant preachers. We've got to embrace that reality. And whatever we have to call it, that will make us more open to fully embracing our whole family. I am open to that. I am open to that. I love being an African-American, being a Black, same gender loving, queer preacher, singer, and mother, as the old folks used to say, and a mother in Zion. I just absolutely love it. I just wish it would all homogenize. You all understand what I mean? So that we can really go home. How about that? How wonderful would that be?
Bishop, thank you for beautifully pulling us into your own vantage point to be able to see the evolution of language and words and identity, and even grounding it in Blackness. Absolutely brilliant. Thank you for that. It was a sort of display of your ongoing work to deconstruct and to talk about Black religious experience. And so that brings us to Danyelle Thomas, whose public work is also focused on deconstructing the Black religious experience, specifically Black Protestant Christianity. So we are so happy to have her on our panel today on Black queer Christianities. Reverend Thomas, you address Black Christians as being frustrated with the experiences of religious trauma and hypocrisy, something that all of us on this panel know something about. Your work describes religious deconstruction as yet another prison of a hegemony that brings liberation to those whose embodied realities present no flaws. Then you make this statement. You say, in many ways, religious deconstruction is to queer as religious decolonization is to quare. Could you say more about that for our listeners and expound on it? That was a brilliant statement, and I would love to hear you speak more about that.
Sure. So for me, like, let's call a thing a thing. There is a pervasive whiteness that happens when we talk about these terms like religious deconstruction and queerness. For me, when I hear the word queer, it stops me in my tracks. It is disruptive. it causes me to have to stop and to think why that particular nuance is necessary. Why do we need to name and call a thing in a way? And it really kind of resides for me in that point of we're all the same. And I am not sure that sameness or normalization and homogeneity is actual justice. I don't know if that's the goal of justice. So for me, when I make those comparative statements, it is to say that, like, it's one thing to say, okay, we need to deconstruct religion so that it is more open and affirming of essentially the expression, in my experience, of cis heteronormative sexuality. There is a let's normalize sex outside of marriage as both wholly sacred and whole, which it is, but it stops there. Whereas when we get to decolonization of religion, we begin to ask the questions of why it ever came to be in the first place. Who made the textual exegesis for that in the first place, and who benefits from that oppression? So for me, queerness is this thing, or queer theory in that way is very much like, well, we want to raise, our difference from the larger, majority of people, let's say straightness, but it stops there. Whereas queer says, you're telling me to let go of my homophobic family, but that's also my community. And they also love me deeply. And whereas some of their language and their behavior and their beliefs and their ideology is simultaneously harmful, I also don't feel this quite deep fit in what I should feel in this sameness, or we're all the same, of queerness. So for me, when I talk about deconstruction versus decolonization, it goes the step further to make that finer point of saying who is benefiting from our oppression, and in what ways are we participants in our oppression by our use of language, by our call for justice that isn't always equitable, right? So it was named earlier about women being second-class citizens. Bishop named that. And I immediately thought, and then our queer folks become the tertiary class because women tend to sacrifice, cis heteronormative women in the church tend to sacrifice queer folks at the altar for proximity to patriarchal power in the church. So we can't ignore that, like, for women who are like, let's throw away the parts of the text that say that we should be silent and we should not be called to preach, who then turn around and also use that same text to browbeat and to basically effectively kill folks who are same gender loving, who then become the sacrificial lamb to say, look at me, hey, power, hey, proximity power, can I get access to that? So that is why I went there with that. It's very much, we have to say, where is one stopping and naming it justice, as opposed to what actually is justice for all of us. What I need for justice as a Black queer woman may not be what a Black queer man needs, or what a non-binary person needs as justice. And we can't just say, because we're being open and affirming, that we are being fully inclusive, that we are fully meeting the needs of justice. So when we talk about decolonizing and we talk about queerness, for me, it brings that extra nuance that says, I'm a little bit different and I need my needs treated as such, and that's okay. So, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I loved hearing you talk about how the hermeneutic of suspicion no longer produces suspicion when it is in pursuit of one's own power, and how you describe it as a pursuit for patriarchal power. I want to turn now to Ashon Crawley. Ashon, thank you for talking about regionalism and difference in queerness. And I wonder if you could speak more about that, because I think there's often a desire to sort of tie a bow on top of things in order to make them easily palatable to the dominant conscience. But could you speak more about how you're thinking about this difference and diversity coexisting, especially in the context of regionalism? Okay, while Ashon is gathering with us, I do want to ask if you have any questions for those who are participants listening to this panel. If you have questions, if you would please put those in the Q&A section so that when we open up for Q&A
I was
from the
mostly
group.
trying to say that if quare is the way, can you not hear me?
We can hear you. We can hear you now.
Can you not hear me? I'm so confused by what's happening. Hello?
Ashon, maybe just try turning your video off.
Okay, I had started speaking and then it seemed like, okay, I just want to.
Ashon, your device is going out. I also want to ask while we're waiting on Ashon that if you would also in the Q&A section, if you would please put where you are presently located in the world. Dr. Leath would like to know. Okay.
Wi-Fi, y'all. Can you hello? Can you hear me?
Now we can see you and hear you well.
I don't know, y'all. Technology, I don't know. I was trying to say that in terms of regionalism, what I was trying to mark is that E. Patrick Johnson was being very particular. He was speaking about his grandmother's accent and that everyone does not share that accent. And because everyone does not share that accent, it just, for me, means that we all have a speech pattern with which we operate. And that call to sort of think about the specificity of the relation between queer and quare, for me, means that quare should not be a universal, like everyone does not speak with that accent. It's kind of, it's like what I'm writing about with the Hammond organ musicians who play in Brooklyn. The Hammond organ play with a different set of chord progressions and resolves than someone's playing the same song in Chicago would perhaps play, or someone in the Bay Area, or someone in Houston, or someone in Huntsville, Alabama, that there are regional practices of playing the Hammond organ, and none of them are actually correct. They're just different ways to do it. And most musicians get actually, I think, excited about the differences with which musicians will play the same song that they play. And I have a general argument that I think that musicians and actually singers too actually teach us how to appreciate the practice of the difference of sameness, or the sameness of difference, because you can play the same song and use different chord changes and the congregation will be excited. You can sing the same song that you sang Sunday morning and the congregation didn't move. And for some reason, because the people that are there and something that happened during afternoon, so like the context changes. And so that same song feels different. That I think what we're constantly practicing with one another, our doctrines and theologies do not necessarily say this, but the practice of Black life with one another in spiritual space often seems to me to say that difference is the thing that we're constantly cultivating, and that difference is a thing that we're constantly celebrating, and that you constantly go back and you do it over and over again. Like you try again, you sing the song again, just because you shouted, I'm a Pentecostal too, well, used to be. Just because you shouted in service on Sunday morning doesn't mean that you're gonna come to afternoon service and say, well, I praised the Lord this morning, so I'm never gonna do it again. Like, no, it's like you do it when you feel it. And so for me, it's this constant or this constant recognition of the need for a practice that is ongoing, that is repetitious. And I think that what you do in those repetitions, in those cycles, is that you're constantly changing things. You're constantly noticing the context, you're changing, you're reformatting, you're rethinking, you're recalibrating. And so I think that that's, for me, what, womanist to feminist is also about that recognition of difference, the intensification of a need that has not gone addressed through feminists is the reason why more intensely there is this word womanist, which tries to name a sort of lack. And I think that for me, that's the way that I think about the relationship between queer and queer too, is that it is naming a specificity, and that specificity is something that has gone unremarked, that has been unthought, that has been refused to be thought about. And so by paying attention to that accent, it actually gives me I also would pay attention to accents for people who are in the continent and speaking from Nigeria or from Nairobi or from Johannesburg. There are accents there too. And that accent actually means something. It actually can give us a way to think diasporically about the local articulations of a thing called dissidence and difference, that doesn't have to be about dismissing it or dispensing with it or saying that it's a problem, but that just recognizes that it's a thing that emerges in its local space of inhabitation, and we have to think with it and what it makes possible and available for us to imagine possible worlds in liberation with one another. So, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I want to first see if there are any panelists who would like to respond to anything that you've heard from other panelists, and also invite those who are watching the stream this evening, if you have any questions, to please put those in the chat section or in the Q&A so that we can pose those. Any responses from any of our panelists to any of the other panelists? Okay, I'm going to ask a question and we'll pose this.
Hi, Brandon. I was just checking that others. I just want to ask my fellow panelists, what more can we do to ensure reflective theology that are traditionally appropriate and culturally sensitive for queer people in the global South reaches them? What can we do? Any thoughts?
Well, I would certainly like to pick up something that Ashon said, Dr. Ashon, and some things that you said also, Reverend Jide, that Africa is not a country, it's a continent. And I've said this many, many times, right? And I appreciate that, the yes that I'm hearing. And therefore, we are problematic also when we try to speak into an atmosphere without understanding culturally what is going on and what the realities are and what multiples can mean, if you understand what I mean. That there, and the frustration that I think many people have, that we are trying to do work in certain areas, that's because we come off the airplane looking like folks, that means we really understand the cultures. We do not. And I have learned a great deal about allowing people to teach me. Just like I learn when I go and I spend time with people who practice, to someone else's comments earlier, voodoo or olugumi, Santeria, or something like that. When I go into their company, I can see movements that remind me of a good Pentecostal church. If you just turn the volume down and have both of them going at the same time, you'll see some of the same, but the understandings are different. And the understandings of the divine and the worship of the divine and the approach to the divine is very different from one place to another. But I think the same is true. Our absence of respect, even as people from Canada and the US, our absence of respect for that incredible palette of religion and religious practice that exists in the global South is woefully problematic. And this is not, we're not talking about missionaries now. We're just talking about folks who don't really understand what is going on in and among people who look just like all of us look here today. And it's diasporic between the US and Canada. So it's in God's name, diasporic as it relates to where we are in the Caribbean, where we are in the global South. You know, I would encourage us to find ways to cross-pollinate that are authentic. And let me just leave this with you as someone who has been engaged in this work for many, many years, as many of you all know. I make it my business to come into town knowing nothing. And that may not sound like an incredible theological response, but if I come into town knowing nothing, it is amazing what I can leave town knowing. How people then minister to me, share with me when I don't take on the idea of a colonizer, the ideas of a colonizer that are also rooted in so many of us that are a part of having been colonized. And I think that's maybe the best way for me to say it. If I go in and I ask pertinent questions, and I'll tell you this little piece. I was outside of Joburg, way out. And I went to one of the churches, seeking to be affirming churches, as we do in many of the other countries, as you all know. And it was one of my first trips. And I told the people I had to go to the bathroom, okay? And I do really understand this is a very educational moment that we're in right now, but I still got to tell you about this. So I had to go to the bathroom. And so they said, well, you're going to have a problem. And I said, why? They said, because you're wearing pants. I said, so why is that going to be a problem? And I thought for a minute it was because they were talking to me because it was inappropriate for me to wear pants as a woman. But the situation was that the bathroom, the toilet, was a hole in the ground. Anybody walking with me? Now, when you're a guy wearing pants, you can manage. You understand? When you're a woman wearing pants, y'all walking with me? And a dress would have made my situation a whole lot better. Well, my immediate thought was that they were demeaning me for being, you understand, out there as a woman without a dress. That wasn't it at all. It had everything to do with aiming. You cannot aim. Why? I think that if we can do some work across the water, Reverend Jide, even more so than we have in the past, to help people to understand that because you have a heart for it, does not mean that you understand. Go there knowing nothing. And let the common denominators rise up on their own. I think that's the thing that I learned the most.
I would just to add, I think one of the challenges that we find ourselves in is, and this is for me part of the struggle with quare and quare, and to Ashon's point, I think there is complexities that we tend to want to diminish those complexities by finding commonalities in a way that in fact just replicate the system of, quare comes into play because queer doesn't take into consideration the unique distinctiveness of the Black bodies, Black identities, Black experience. And so even as we struggle with a kind of language, I'm not sure we can actually find language if it's not contextually rooted. And so in some ways it's that struggle of wanting to have a big picture, but in the big picture, we do the same thing around why we created the new language in a place, right? We deny the specificity. And I think in some ways, if we can live with the tension between some commonalities, but the reality is that the devil is always in the details. The kind of specific realities is what matters, and how you attend to those things. So I think that's one point for me. I think the second point is fundamentally, part of me has been influenced by Walter Brueggemann and his connection to the creation stories with the exilic stories. That in the context of exile, people who are being diminished, they're reminded that there's a narrative, and the narrative is the creation story, right? And I think in some ways, part of, I said it earlier, I think part of the challenge for us is that as much as we say, God loves everybody, even as we've talked about earlier, there are classes of people in the church and in the system. And I think for me, the liberation is going to come when we understand or appreciate the fundamental humanity of all of us, and the gifts of the differences and diversity of that fundamental humanity. And so for me, it's to find language that invites us to interrogate that notion of our fundamental humanity and the dignity of our humanities. And that's where we start to, I think, wrestle with what language we use.
Thank you. Did any of our other panelists want to respond before we move to the Q&A from our audience? We have one question from Irene Prince. She said, did I understand correctly that quare makes room for straightness, and specifically homophobic straights, ? Can someone help me to understand this? Is queerness inclusive of straightness?
I mean, I'm a weird person that doesn't believe straightness exists. So I think it is a fiction in the same way that whiteness is a fiction. And I think it is a violent fiction, and it does harm to people who do not identify as, nor practice, nor are presumed to be queer, same gender loving, gay, lesbian, whatever terminology you use. But it also does very, very great harm to those who want to really, really, really identify as straight, like more than anything else, because it's an way. It doesn't. It really it becomes like the medical, the psychological justification for patriarchy, in a sort of post-Enlightenment moment of we're no longer, religious people. So what is now going to be the way to codify this kind of mode of relation? And so I wouldn't say that queer opens up space for the inclusivity of straight people. I would actually say that it would help us to abolish the concept of straightness. And, people get really worried about that because they immediately ask, well, are you telling me to have sex with this person? And I'm like, actually, I didn't say anything about sex, even though I think the deep worry and concern over sex is something, the anxiety over sex is also something that needs to be attended to. People have a lot of anxiety about the body and the pleasure of the body and the capacity of the body to hold and to do things and to actually enjoy what they consider to be non-normative pleasure. really scared of it. And so they try to create all these systems to make sure that they never have to actually deal with anything of the so-called non-normative, not because other people are enjoying it, but because they don't want to enjoy it. They don't want to have to think about what does it mean that I enjoy flirting with this boy, even though I'm a boy. Like it becomes existential in terms of a crisis. And so, I can't answer that question because I don't think that straightness should exist. I don't think it should be a mode of identification. Because it is a mode of identification that is literally produced by the violence against those who are not straight, supposedly. And if that is the foundation of it, I don't think there is any chance for a kind of liberatory straightness. Doesn't mean that you can't date or have consensual pleasures with the people of genders who you desire, but it would probably also open up your imagination to enjoy more and to actually consent more and to actually be more just in your erotic pleasure. But because we think, or not we, but a lot of people think that these are the two things that you can do. There's a lot of anxiety that goes into the upholding of these two binary ways of existence, and a lot of literal violence that is used to help secure that anxiety as sort of self-perpetuating. So you don't even know that it's anxiety. You just think, oh, this is just the natural way things are. It's like, well, I don't know. So that would be my messy response to the question.
Thank you. And to echo what you said, even if we were to change this word straightness to heterosexual persons, it is so reminiscent of the idea of Blackness needing to make room for whiteness that it almost makes me want to just be bold enough and say that no, queerness does not make room for heterosexuality, because this is a space that has been carved out specifically for these persons in the same way that we do with whiteness. And so, Irene, we thank you for your question. It just sparked a response out of us that I think is connected to our own experiences. I wanted
to say something quickly.
Yes.
I think straightness could be seen as a temporary place for even queer people. Because I was married to a woman before I came out as gay, so I think in that time I would have been considered straight. And people still ask me today, "Are you sure you're not bisexual?" I said, "No, I'm not bisexual. I'm actually gay." So I think I found myself in that place of straightness because of my environment, because of what religion has said to me. But I think the other thing I would say about straightness is a protected community by default. So again, no one will see a man and a woman hold hand or kiss on the street and even bite an eyelid or even notice it these days. But if it happened between same gender loving individuals, attention will be drawn, and even to some extent we might even congratulate them for their courage and boldness, which doesn't apply to straightness. I think the other thing about straightness is also spoken rights. And also I believe it's also a kind of sense of forced security, because if we cannot afford to same gender loving people the freedom and non-discrimination as we to straight people, then I think that takes away the whole idea of straightness. Thank you.
Thank you. So we are at the 10:46 hour, and I've received word from our leader that we need to turn towards final words. So I want to ask each panelist to respond in just a maximum of 120 seconds, 2 minutes. And I want you to frame your thinking around your final comments can embrace and include whatever it is that you want to say. But I would ask, since the title of our panel was originally Black Queer Christianity or Christianities, maybe let's change that to queer Christianity. And how do you sort of think about queer Christianity? This panel is talking about Christianity specifically. How are you thinking about that or not thinking about that? We welcome both of those responses. So let's start Reverend Jide, and then we'll go to Dr. Blair, to Bishop Flunder, and then to Dr. Crowley, and then we will end with Danyelle Thomas.
Thank you so much. Again, for the record, I'm a Black man, and I think that's the most obvious thing. I am African, I'm British, I'm a Christian, I am gay. I even describe myself as a happy, holy homosexual. I'm a theologian, and becoming a theologian is something that I did because I have so many questions. And of course, and Desmond Tutu did say, the late Desmond Tutu said, I will not worship a God who is homophobic. So here we are today, and that is still part of the conversations that we're having. But as for queer Christianity, I think the message for me, as I close, is that we need to be better organized, because those who come against us, those who want to deconstruct our liberation and queer theology, are better organized or well organized. We need to occupy. And I think that, when Bishop Flunder was speaking earlier on about taking our place in the churches, in the industry, even in businesses, we need to occupy. My ordination to priesthood is about that occupation as well. We need to take ownership, and we need to overtake the nuisances that we see. I will close by saying that for me, our queer Christianity must encapsulate, the importance of GAY. For me, it means God adores you, God accepts you, and God anoints you. Thank you.
I guess for me, this notion, I was very deeply appreciative of the title of this conversation in terms of the pluralities. And so again, I'm somebody who want to live in the intersection of the pluralities. And when I think about queer Christianities, that there is a wide diversity of expression. And part of that would allow us to, I come from Jamaica, which is my homeland, and one of the Christian expression is a tradition. Here we call it the spiritual Baptist in Canada, but it's the kind of Puckamania that is a fairly valid expression of Christian worship. Tends to be populated mostly by queer folks who live in the closet, to Bishop Flunder's thing. But there's a richness in that. And if we can start to think about this multiplicity, this kind of diversity, this complexity of Christian expression, Christian worship, Christian belief, a kind of a tapestry, then I think we begin to kind of move into the liberative space that the conversation around queerness actually was an attempt to kind of say, we're here, we're different, we're out, we're loud. And if we can somehow live with the tension of complexities, I think that's a gift. And so I would say part of it is that, how do we live with the complexity of our diversities?
Am I next? All right. Well, first of all, it was a great joy, a blessing for me to be in conversation with all of you all. You know, I love you deeply, and being in the struggle together with such fine minds and such powerful thinkers is a great blessing. It's food for my soul, and I'm grateful, deeply grateful. And I think there was a song that was sung by the Williams Brothers from Mississippi Gospel Music Quartet that was called "Sweep Around Your Own Front Door Before You Try to Sweep Around Mine." It's one of those good gospel songs, good gospel quartet songs. But I think the truism in that for me, Ashon, is that we are in full-on reformation right now as a Christian church. We didn't choose to be, but we are. And it has been definitely seasoned by the COVID pandemic. And also the shifts and changes. People who hate people don't seem to know how best to find out how their enemies are functioning. So we have folks who think they're going to win public positions and win votes, finding out that they weren't even near where they thought they were. So we're not cross-pollinating. I think that reality is true for us also in the LGBTQI, queer, gender nonconforming, queer universe. I think we need to spend some time, not so much with nomenclature, but with what it means now in this moment for us to see each other day by day. Old song in the folks who worked with music on stage. They used to sing in those plays day by day. Oh, dear Lord, three things I pray: to see thee more clearly, to love thee more dearly, to follow thee more nearly. There's something very powerful about that. And I think is a gathering in. And if we want to call it queer, if that's who we want to be, what does it mean if it doesn't mean that everyone has a seat?
Yeah.
If everyone does not have a seat, we are just choosing another name and creating another box. So that is my hope and prayer that will be the outcome. And again, thank you so much for inviting me to have this conversation and working with my Methodist Baptist self. And that I pray that what will come of this is a revolution, an evolution, and a reformation, because that is absolutely what time it is and what we need. God bless you all.
I'll reiterate and say thank you for the invitation, and was glad to be a part of the panel. I'll just say I think that we are in the middle of a reformation, to follow Bishop Flunder, because I also think we're in a moment of crisis. I have had the sad pleasure of watching a lot of sermons since the beginning of 2022, when people are, kind of gathering back in person in different sort of denominational church context. And I have been fascinated that given the impact that COVID has had on the life worlds of Black religious, spiritual folks in different organizations, different denominations, I've been really, really fascinated by how, just intensely homophobic everyone has been, and intensely sexist they've been. And there's always two ways for me to read that. One is that, it's really sad, which it is. It's horrible. It's violent. But I also think it is a reaction. And it's a reaction to the fact of the people are no longer willing to get themselves a little husband. Some people are, but there are a lot more that are refusing that logic altogether, and that are willing to say so emphatically and with joy. And I think that it has caused a lot of crises for a whole bunch of people, because they continue to wonder, well, if you made that choice, then what am I supposed to do? And so I think it is critical that we continue these kinds of conversations. And I'm thankful that I was able to be a part of this one. Thank you.
So I'm wrapping it up, and I actually want to do this in the context of a question that was asked from Maryland. What would Jesus say if he came back today about the heterosexual normative framework of salvation? And for me, that begins in interrogating why salvation is such a key component of liberation. If we think about it, that white supremacy tends to use Christianity as its religion of choice, as a fulcrum in the work of hegemony, because Christianity, of the three Abrahamic faiths, is the one that has a salvation tenet. And often white supremacy creates the problems and situations in which we need salvation from. And so in those ways, it tends to put us in this position of feeling that how we are created, how we are made, how we are fearfully and wonderfully made is something to be more fearful of than in awe of the wonders about, including our sexuality, or maybe especially our sexuality. And so in that way, when I think about it, it is to say that to quare Christianity, then, particularly to quare our Black Christian experience, is to say that my salvation is not in being delivered from who and how I love, but rather in making more room to love myself in full and in whole, and to know that my life abundant that is promised to me through salvation can only be done by doing away with the things that would otherwise become a imperative to that, something that would not allow that to happen, including homophobia, transphobia, antagonisms, and all of the such. And so I would think Jesus would come back and say what he said in the beginning, which is, I come that you might have life and have life more abundantly. And if there is anything that is in the way of that abundant life, then we must do the work of justice to rectify and spread that abundance, rather than pushing this narrative of scarcity and salvation as this response to scarcity and elitism. So for me, having this conversation is a reminder of the ways in which we can continue to quare the text. We can continue to darken the text. We can continue to fem the text in ways that we see ourselves as both holy and divine. So thank you for having me, for participating here.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Dr. Crowley, are you there?
Yes.
I just want to invite everybody to, all of our panelists to come back on camera, if you don't mind. And would you, do you have any closing word? Or I didn't want to, I just so thank you for your moderation, and go right ahead if you do.
Oh, okay. No, I have nothing to say. No.
All right. Well, I just want to thank you and provide just a little bit of information for what's coming next. And just want to say that I just cannot applaud and thank Reverend Dr. Brandon Crowley, Bishop Yvette Flunder, Reverend Jide Macaulay, Danyelle Thomas, Reverend Michael Blair, Dr. Ashon Crawley, for being here and for the ways that you have led and directed this conversation and brought new insight to this line of thought. So I'd just like to invite you to please join us for the next iteration of this conversation on the 19th of January, 2023 at 7 p.m. And I'm going to be sharing the flyer for that event. That's the third of the 4-part series. Please circulate that widely and join with us again. We'll also want to invite you to join the podcast, the Black Studies podcast, and I'll be sharing a link to that as well. And just want to thank you for everything that you have that you've done, and ask you to please join us again. So with that, this concludes the formal panel. There is an informal talk back. There are some folks who have joined us from the AME Church, and we will invite them to share a little bit and also to hear back a little bit further. But we are so grateful and respect your time, and are glad to have had you here. And so thank you again, and look forward to seeing you.
Bye. Thank you. Thank you. I gotta go take care of the dog.
Bye.
Bye, y'all.
Bye-bye. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Love you all. I've got to run too, but
Love you, Bishop.
Bye.
It was wonderful. Let's keep talking. It's just
Thank
great.
you.
Just
Thank you,
great.
Bishop.
Blessings, everyone.
Greetings, everybody. It's late in London, so it's 10 p.m. now, and I need to get to another location.
Yes, indeed. Thank you so much.
Take care, folks. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.